Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Shadow Warrior for PC, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4. This is a first-person shooter and the reboot, or reimagining, whichever you prefer to say, although the developers use the term reimagining, of the original Shadow Warrior, which was released in 1997 and was developed by 3D Realms. This one was developed by Flying Wild Hog and published by Devolver Digital, first for PC in September of last year, and this year actually, in October, it saw release on PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. And it's kind of an interesting game. I didn't really expect Shadow Warrior to be remade, or even have a sequel of any kind. It always stood alone as its own entity to me, and particularly in this day and age, you couldn't really do what Shadow Warrior did, because people would get all in a tizzy and say it's horribly racist and offensive and this, that, and the other thing. If you actually play the original Shadow Warrior, yes, there's a lot of racist humor in it, but it's not necessarily offensive. It's making fun of racial stereotypes. And so it's things that are just completely over the top and ridiculous. You couldn't really find it insulting unless you're somebody who's just incredibly easy to offend. So what happened here? Did they just completely abandon what Shadow Warrior was and do their own thing and just slap the Shadow Warrior name on it to make a quick buck off of people's nostalgia? Or does this thing actually live up to the original? Well, as far as the presentation goes, it looks really solid all around. You've got some very, very nice animations in particular that are very smooth and fluid. You've got a lot of very detailed environments that are huge, and a lot of them are wide open. There's a lot of destructible stuff in the environments, which is very, very nice. The lighting effects are fantastic. The only things I really had issues with are some of the texture quality. It could be better. I've seen far worse, don't get me wrong, but that's kind of where the presentation as far as visuals just suffers a bit. It's not a huge deal, but they could have done better with it. And then there's the sound design, which is fairly interesting. You have some pretty solid music that's trying to capture that Asian vibe and works pretty well for the most part. You've got some rather intense metal at certain parts that I'm not really a fan of because it's death metal and I just don't like that genre of metal. But you may be able to get something out of it. And they actually have some Easter eggs in the game where other Devolver Digital published games like Hotline Miami and Serious Sam are in the game as arcade cabinets, and you can actually go up to them and put some money into the cabinets and it'll start playing music from the game, which is also kind of cool. But the sound effects are glorious. You've got some very, very nice, beefy sound effects that make your weapons feel powerful, and when you have the effect on target, it just is glorious to listen to the almost stereotypical sounds of katana slashing through demons and such, and having these ridiculously cheesy spraying sounds, and just eviscerating your enemies with all sorts of wild weaponry. That's all fantastic. And then there's the voice acting, which is hit or miss. Some characters, like Lo Wang, are actually pretty well voiced. Others, not so much. And it just comes down to some rather stilted ways of speaking. You could still tell, though, that the voice actors just had a lot of fun with this thing because they were saying completely ridiculous things, and they tried to make it as cheesy as possible. Particularly with Lo Wang and Hoji just cracking jokes constantly, and some of them fall flat as they're supposed to because they're meant to be ridiculously cheesy, but others not so much, and the game actually ends up having a fair amount of character as a result. But obviously what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and this game actually puts more emphasis on story than the original game did. I can see why. It's a more modern game. They're trying to do a more modern interpretation, and even though they tried with it, they failed miserably with regards to keeping the player engaged in the storyline, because while you do have some pretty solid humor with regards to certain characters, while you do have some fairly interesting ideas here and there, it never really connects all that well, and by the end you don't really care. You're kind of playing it just for the gameplay's sake, and the ending just leaves you going, meh. So it's something that you don't really pay much attention to while you're playing it, And more often than not, you'll probably find yourself skipping cutscenes because they're just not very engaging or anything like that. So, how is the gameplay? Well, I'm happy to report that this is where they put the emphasis. Now, it is a very different game from the original Shadow Warrior. In fact, it plays almost nothing like the original Shadow Warrior. This is actually a very, very weird hybrid of ideas, and surprisingly enough, it works. On the one hand, you have your basic, very arcadey, action-oriented first-person shooter gameplay. You can tell that Flying Wild Hog has a lot of members from the old Painkiller development team, because there's a lot of vibe from that sort of thing in this, where you just have a bunch of monster box rooms. Although they're pretty well dressed up and they don't really feel so much like monster box rooms. But that style of gameplay is still here. You're going to have a lot of enemies coming at you all at once. And luckily, you have a pretty decent arsenal to eviscerate those foes with. You start with a katana. And this is actually the most interesting weapon in the entire game, because the melee in this game is fantastic. It's very simple. You have your basic left mouse button quick slashes, you have your right mouse button charge slashes, but then after a bit in the game you unlock chi abilities. And these allow you to do different things, in particular when you have the sword. For example, one ability you have with the sword is to double tap backwards and hit left mouse button. If you hold that, then you will actually charge up a wave attack. Or you can double tap forward and hold the left mouse button to charge up a very powerful thrust. So you have these interesting mechanics with regards to the katana. But that's not really what makes it so entertaining. It's the fact that you just slice and dice your foes into tiny bits. And the gore system in this game is just glorious. You're seeing almost typical anime style slashes and ridiculous amounts of blood and guts spraying everywhere. And it's completely over the top and extremely satisfying to just go around slaughtering demons with the katana. Now, if you don't want to use the katana, and you might not for certain enemies because they're tougher and they don't go down as easily when you're using that, you're going to be using the wider arsenal of weapons that you have. This first one that you're going to come into contact with is a revolver, which you can eventually upgrade using money. In fact, all of the weapons except the katana can be upgraded using money. You just collect money throughout the levels. And after a while, you get enough money to buy an unlock for one of your weapons. For example, with the revolver, one of the unlocks is the ability to fire it cowboy style, where you're fanning the hammer. Because it's a single action revolver, so that's a much faster rate of fire, but it's less accurate, for example. And there's other things too. One of the things for the crossbow you get is to launch exploding crossbow bolts, which are glorious, and they're just like a remote charge. You get things like the rocket launcher being able to fire 3 rockets at once. Hello, Unreal Tournament, right? But the one thing I hate about the upgrades is that you never seem to have enough money to get all of them. You may be able to at higher difficulty settings. I only played this on the normal difficulty setting, but I didn't get enough money to actually upgrade all of my weapons all the way. Similarly, I didn't get enough chi crystals or karma points to upgrade my powers and skills, respectively, all the way. Your powers, you have to find chi crystals to actually be able to upgrade, and those are things like the wave attack that I mentioned, also things like improving your healing, because you have a healing ability that you have to actually charge up instead of having regenerating health, like so many modern games. You actually have a health number, and you can charge it up to a certain degree. It starts off being basically 65 health points, and then after a while you can upgrade it to get about 80% of your health back, and then you have to get the rest back up with health packs that are scattered throughout the levels. You can also get fortune cookies for 5 hit points, and they also display a silly message for you, and so you can have fun with that. But You'll find money scattered throughout the levels, you'll find health packs scattered throughout the levels, you'll also find ammo scattered throughout the levels, and bowls of blood that actually give you karma points, or at least they give you points towards your karma points. You gain points towards your karma by varying up your attack patterns, so you can use different powers, like, again, the wave attack, or just the spinning attack that you get later on, if you want to anyway. Things like that to change up the way you eviscerate your foes, and the more efficient and varied you are, the higher your rating is going to be, and the more points you're going to earn from that, which in turn will be more likely to get you more karma points. Karma points you spend on skills, which are basically passive bonuses. Things like improvements to doing damage to lower or greater demons, or improving your health, or improving your stamina regeneration, because you have a dash maneuver you can do by just pressing a direction and tapping the shift key. Or you can hold the shift key and press forward and you'll start sprinting. And the movement system is actually very intuitive, very smooth, works really, really well. I did run into a few glitches here and there with it, where I would just get launched off of something, which was both amusing and infuriating, because when I get launched off of something, more likely than not, I'm going to fall too far and just go to my doom. So that can be a problem. But if you're paying attention, you should be fine. And that fast movement system really does help when you actually get into the meat of the game. Obviously, upgrading your weapons, upgrading your skills, upgrading your powers is there for a reason. Game gets harder as you go through, because you get not only access to all these powers and such, but the enemies are going to become more varied as you go through the game. You start out with your basic demons, which are just kind of running up to you and smacking you upside the face. They're very easy to deal with. In fact, the very, very early parts of the game are almost too easy, and they lull you into a false sense of security by the end game. And then you find more and more complicated enemies. Some of them have the ability to raise the fallen demons in a skeletal form, which means they're really easy to take down, but they are persistent. And so that gets kind of annoying. So obviously you're going to want to deal with those. But then there's also things that are basically huge minotaurs, and they can launch out basically the scorpion get over here spear maneuver, or you'll run into these massive golem-like things which will just charge you, and you pretty much only do damage to them by hitting them in the back. And so there's all sorts of enemies that you'll encounter throughout the game that each have their own strengths and weaknesses and their own ways you can deal with them. And so that's where the arsenal comes in. You may think, well, I just want to use the katana the whole game because it's incredibly fun to use, and just slicing and dicing demons is just incredibly satisfying. Well, yeah. And sure, it doesn't use up ammunition of any kind. But it's a lot harder to deal with something like flying enemies, or enemies where you need to target a specific point. And so that's where the rest of your arsenal comes in. And so there's this nice balance there, even though they did put quite a bit of emphasis on the katana itself. Now, over time, throughout playing the campaign, you will get access to unlocks for the katana, and the last unlock for it is glorious, because now it's shooting out those waves that you used to be able to charge up, only it's shooting them out with each swing. So, that's just wonderful, being able to slice and dice enemies at a distance. But there's one problem with that, and that's that you only get that at the last level. And so you barely get a chance to use it before the game ends. And that's kind of annoying. There are other issues that the game has too. And the first of these is that the boss fights are incredibly underwhelming. You're fighting these absolutely gigantic bosses. And the strategy is always shoot the big glowy thing until it gets in a more vulnerable position, and then you can actually do damage to the thing by shooting the other big glowy thing. So basically every boss fight ever from the past several FPSs that actually have had boss fights. It's kind of annoying, actually. Luckily, the boss fights are fairly few and far between. And then the other issue I had with the game, with regards to its design, was that toward the end it started to drag. because it gets repetitive. Obviously, you're doing pretty much the exact same thing the entire game, and it does get repetitive. You do have a bit of an overload on the stupid jokes by the end game, and you just kind of had enough of them. And by then, the plot has kind of run out, and it's really just the solid gameplay that's keeping you going. So it does get repetitive, it does eventually start to lose steam, but by the time it's losing steam, you're basically at the end of the game, and it doesn't really matter all that much because you've only got about the last 2 levels to go. So it's fine. As far as first-person shooters these days go, it is a bit long at about 8 to 10 hours, depending on how quick you are in this game and what difficulty you're playing on. It took me about 10 hours because I got stuck at a couple of points just from me basically failing miserably at dodging and things like that. And because I was kind of deliberately seeking out secret areas and such like that, because the game actually does have secret areas. They're not so secret, they're actually very easy to find, which is kind of lame, but it's nice that the game even has them in the first place. But it starts to drag once you get toward the 7-8 hour mark, so that is a concern. And there are some other issues that I had, but this is probably mostly on my end. I did have some performance issues. Most of the game actually ran fine and was very playable, but there were a lot of segments where it would just drop the frame rate dramatically, and I wasn't entirely sure why. Sometimes it made sense because there was a lot of things on screen at once, but other times not so much, where there wasn't really anything going on except maybe some waves crashing, and I really don't think the water effects would have done all that much, but apparently they did, because I would go from basically close to 100 FPS down to 60 FPS down to 30 or less. And in fact, in those segments where there was a lot of waves crashing, it would go down into the 20 range. It was kind of ridiculous, actually. And with a lot of enemies on screen, the frame rate would just tank. It was still playable, but it did get kind of annoying. And I did have some issues being able to see, and that was largely due to the bloom lighting on certain objects, just kind of oversaturating and making it hard to make certain things out. But that's something you can get used to, sort of. You just start to expect it after a while. And most of the time, the bloom lighting doesn't really get in your way, so it's only when you're really needing to pay attention to things that are bright and glowy and just kind of blow up in your face. So, of course, right? But all that said, Shadow Warrior is a very, very fun FPS, even though it does have issues. It has plenty of issues, don't get me wrong. And another of those issues is it doesn't have any multiplayer. That was another big fun thing in the original game, that the original had some actually really fun multiplayer. This one doesn't have any at all. It's only single player, which is fine. It's just that it's a bit of a disappointment. There are other modes you can play after you finish the game. There's EX mode, which is basically just New Game Plus, where you play through the game again, only you've got all of your upgrades and such from the last mission of the campaign. And the only difference here is that you don't start with all the katana stuff. You just start with all of your powers, your skills, that sort of thing. And then you have the heroic mode, where it's basically just a super hard, you only get the one save at the beginning of the level kind of things. And then there's survival mode, which is your basic fend off hordes of enemies mode. It's not particularly interesting, although that's where the fun gameplay might actually be something that saves that mode. So there's not a huge amount of variety here. It is a fun game to play no matter what, but it does wear thin after quite a while of playing. That's worth noting. But by that point, it's not really that big of a deal. The complaints I do have about this game aren't really enough to bring it down. Obviously, the boss fights are a problem. The fact that the game wears thin after a while is a problem. But again, by that point, it's okay. You've gotten your money's worth. You've enjoyed the game. And it's just a very solid FPS, and the gameplay, even by the end game, is just rather satisfying. It does ramp up the difficulty toward the end, so if you were complaining about it being easy, then, well, the end isn't so easy. And it does enough different to make it well worth playing, and still manages to be a good homage to the original game. In fact, they actually put the credits to the original game's staff in their credits, which was actually really cool. I really liked seeing that. And there's just so many throwbacks to the original game, so many one-liners that you had from the original game, and just constant references to it.
Sword. For when you want to make it personal.
And it really does feel like the developers just really loved the original and wanted to do something that pays homage to it, but is still a modern take on it and does its own thing, really. And so, what you have with Shadow Warrior, with regards to this reboot anyway, is a very solid FPS that's very fun to play and does enough different that makes it well worth checking out, particularly if you're an FPS fan. And if you are a fan of the original game, and you looked at this thing and you at first thought that it looked horrible because it's just not the original. Well, no, it isn't. It does its own thing. But the spirit of the original game is there. And I think that's what really matters here. Overall, I give it a 4 out of 5. Thanks for watching.